a starter, just explain to us what it means to be brainstem dead.
Yes, so the brainstem is the lower part of the brain just above the spine that's responsible for keeping us alive, really. It's the part of the brain that controls our breathing, controls our blood pressure, controls our consciousness. And what the doctors have to do is to make sure that that part of the brain is not functioning. And there are a number of tests that can confirm that.
So can you just explain to us how the clinical process works for someone to be declared brainstem dead?
Sure. Well, they need usually two doctors to perform those tests, and they should be independent of the hospital or the family, although obviously the hospital and the family have a right to say and offer an opinion. But two independent doctors should undertake those tests at a time apart as well. You do it once and you do it again some days, usually later. And what they have to do is to test so-called reflexes of the brainstem. And there are a number of things. For example, they look at the pupils of the eye and they shine a light in the eye. And if you shine a light into the eye, usually the pupil constricts. And in someone who's brainstem dead, it doesn't constrict. They have fixed, dilated pupils. You can do something called the corneal reflex. You can put a little bit of cotton wool on the eye, and normally people will blink. That reflex is not there either. You can do what sounds an odd test of putting cold water in the ear, and that will induce eye movements in people with brainstem reflexes, and it doesn't in people who are brainstem dead. You check whether there's any motor response. In other words, sometimes that's a painful stimulus to see what the person does. See if there's no cough reflex or gag reflex, something we're familiar with after all those COVID tests. You gag when you put something at the back of the throat. Probably the main test is where you actually take someone off the ventilator for a few minutes, and the carbon dioxide in the blood will build up, which is a big stimulus to breathing, and you see if someone will breathe under those circumstances. And I presume the doctors at the hospital have gone through those tests and confirmed, therefore, that sadly Archie is brainstem dead.
Can there be disagreements between doctors over whether those functions are operating as they should?
No, really, because they're fairly definitive tests. You can see whether someone's blinking, you can see whether they've got a cough reflex. It's not something, you can see whether they're breathing when you take them off the ventilator or not. It's a fairly black and white response. Sometimes the situation is confused by what are called spinal reflexes, and these are reflexes below the brain. Sometimes people who are brainstem dead can still twitch a finger or move a foot, sometimes spontaneously, sometimes a stimulus. And of course, totally understandably, some families will misinterpret that, and they'll touch a hand and the hand appears to grasp. That doesn't mean the person is not brainstem dead. It means that the reflex to make that happen goes through the spine and not through the brain. So sometimes there are confusing factors, but generally this is a diagnosis that is relatively straightforward if the two doctors are trained, know what they're doing, and come to that conclusion. And
if they do come to that very sad conclusion, how do doctors break the news to the family members?
Well, it's such a sad and difficult process. It's simply a matter of sitting down and patiently telling the family, going through what I've said, maybe going through it several times, because obviously in those distressing circumstances, people aren't taking things in. And explain, for example, that the gripping of the hand or twitching of the foot does not necessarily mean the person is not brainstem dead. So it's a matter of honest, straightforward appraisal given to the family in simple terms. I don't mean that rudely, but not in complicated terms that the family's not going to understand, but in simple, straightforward terms. And in most of the time, the family will understand what's happening, and most of the time, with reluctance, clearly and sadly agree with it, but not always.